So when it comes to a Cold Fusion application, I've always felt comfortable rendering views, typically within some sort of a framework like Framework 1 or ColdBox. But I've never really had the best mental model for how to generate a report, because a report isn't really a view within an application. And while it has client-facing aspects, it's not really part of the client-side code. So I've never quite known how to categorize report and where to put all of the logic for report generation. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately in the context of some work stuff. And I've come up with a pattern that I'm kind of enjoying. So note that this is sort of a, as of today, this is what I'm doing, but not necessarily the best approach. And of course, keep in mind, there's a million different ways to try and approach something like this. And the basic idea is that I want to keep all of the logic around report generation co-located within the server, because it makes the code easier to find, easier to read, and easier to maintain. So let's jump into this generate CFM file. And this is just sort of the controller layer of the application that's going to be responsible for invoking our report. Now, the report in this case is going to be downloading these photos of me and my friend Vicky and generating a report that showcases these photos with some embedded CSS and JavaScript. And now the actual meat of the demonstration is going to be inside this report generator, Cold Fusion component, that I'm going to pass this data, this project and photos data, to using the only public method that it has, generate report, and all of the logic around generating the report happens right there. So before we look at what's actually being generated, or how things are being generated, let's look at the outcome, which is going to be a zip file that contains the report and the photos. So if we jump back over here and we hit generate report, you'll see I get a download. If I open that up, you can see I have a index file and a photos directory. So I have just the two photos right from the collection here. And if we drag and drop this into the browser, you will see here is my important report. Here are the photos of Vicky and myself. You can see it is styled, and in fact, if we do looking at the source here, let me pump this up, we can see that it has some embedded CSS. We can also see that it has the embedded JSON payload. In fact, if we come back here and we look at the window.config, you can see there is the photos and the project definition. Right? If we jump back into the source code, you can also see there's some inline JavaScript here, which is just outputting this "it is now," which no one even noticed probably is at the bottom here, just a little, just to demonstrate that there's actually JavaScript happening. So how are we actually getting this payload? How are we getting a zip file that contains an index file? That index file has dynamic data because it was actually a CFML template that we rendered as HTML. And how does that all come together? So now let's take a look at the report generator. But first, actually, let's look at the file system. And we can see here I have a report folder. And if we look at the report generator, you can see it lives in the report folder. So now I'm going to have co-located with this Cold Fusion component a number of other things. You can see the report generator CFC. We also have an assets folder and a templates folder. The assets folder is for the client side aspects of the report, the CSS, the JavaScript, any kinds of other embedded objects or linked objects we might need to include. And then the templates, which is the Cold Fusion templates that are going to be used to render the report. In this case, we have just one, and you can see it's outputting the photos, but we'll come back and look at that in more detail. So now that we understand that all of this stuff is co-located, right, the JavaScript, the CSS, the CFML files, the generator CFC, let's go ahead and take a look at what is actually going on under the hood, right? So let's take a look at this generate report, which is the only public function. And let's give ourselves some more room here. I've tried to keep this as simple as possible while adding enough functionality to showcase some of the usefulness, I think. So here's a generate report. You can see we're passing in the data. This with temp directory is just a private method, which we'll look at later. It takes a callback, creates a temp directory, manages that temp directory under the hood, which means it cleans up after itself, and passes it to this callback. We then generate the report using a few steps. Step 1, we download the photos. Step 2, we render the report, so that's rendering the CFML file as an HTML file. And step 3 is we generate the zip, and you can see we return it, which we're then returning back to the calling context, which is of course here, which then gets sent back to the user. So let's take a look at these steps individually. So let's jump to the download photos. The download photos uses a really cool feature of Lucee CFML, which is a parallelization of the iteration function. So in this case, we're going to be using map, and if we look down at the bottom here, you can see we're using true to tell it to use parallel iteration, and we're going to tell it to use 6 threads. 20 is the default. I'm lowering it to 6 because it's doing file downloading, and I don't want to overwhelm the network or the CPU. And essentially what this is going to do is going to call this operator on each element in this photo, and it's going to do it in parallel using up to 6 threads. Here we're going to be using the virtual file system from Lucee to read from the remote URL. So this file copy is actually going to be doing an HTTP request under the hood and saving that to a photos directory, which is inside that working directory that we talked about above. And then we're just going to return a response whether it was successfully downloaded or if there was an error. We're not actually doing anything with these responses, but I think it's an interesting pattern. All right, so downloading the photos already has some pretty cool functionality. Step 2, rendering the report. And that's really the most interesting parts of this perhaps. So if we jump down to render report, let's look at what's going on. So we're going to be taking a CFML file and we're going to be rendering it and capturing it as an HTML file, which we're then using and including in our zip archive. So part of that includes inlining a JSON payload, JavaScript object notation payload, into the client-side code. And because of that, it's going to be consumed in a client-side JavaScript context, which means that we have to make sure that our casing is true. You can set this at the server level, but again, I'm trying to make this demo interesting, so we're going to use a processing directive and tell this chunk of code here to preserve case, which means that when I have lowercase project, it's going to get serialized as lowercase. And when I have lowercase c, uppercase f in client file name, it's going to have lowercase c, uppercase f when it is serialized as JSON later on. So that's an interesting little technique. We're sanitizing the data, meaning that this project and photos data may have stuff we don't actually want to expose to a front-end user. So we're going to create a sanitized version of the payload that we include inside our report. We don't want to leak sensitive information. We don't want to leak PII, personally identifiable information. We want to keep the report clean. Step 2 in this sub-algorithm here is now rendering the CFML file as HTML. So we're doing a couple of really interesting things here, in my opinion. One is we have a closure. That closure is using local mode modern, which means that any unscoped variable assignments that happen inside this function implicitly get set to the local scope of this closure, meaning they don't leak out into the private scope of the component. Now, this closure is being executed, you'll see here, as part of what people call an IFI, or an immediately invoked function expression, which means that we're going to define the expression and then we're going to immediately invoke it. So this closure is essentially going to be invoked immediately, and we're going to be capturing the result of that function execution as this report HTML. So what is the function execution? The function execution includes our report template, our CFML file, right, which is what we saw right over here. It's going to be including that, and that gets interpreted as a Cold Fusion page, which means that it interpolates variables into its output, and then we're capturing that output as part of a string buffer, and we're returning that string buffer. So essentially this chunk of code here is safely, using local mode modern, executing a CFML page with variable access via this closure to the calling context, capturing that output in a buffer and returning that buffer, and then we're writing that buffer to an HTML file within our working directory. I think that's awesome. Look at this. It's like 10 lines of code doing some pretty snazzy stuff. And let's just take a look at what's going on inside our template here. So just a heads up, right? So I have this config object. So inside this CFML template, we're going to be rendering our HTML file. Here we can use all of our built-in Cold Fusion functions like encode for HTML, encode for HTML attribute, encode for JavaScript. But then you can see I also have other functions here that are not built in. Include styles. We have one down here for include scripts. Those are actually private methods on our report generator CFC. Now, here's another cool thing that this 10 lines of code is doing. Because you are including a CFML file into a CFC file, right, a CFML markup file into a Cold Fusion component, what we're technically doing is creating a mix-in, right? We're executing this code as if it were part of this Cold Fusion component, which means that this template has access to all of the variables and the private methods, and public methods, but private methods more specifically, that the component has. So this inline scripts and inline styles is actually part of this report generation. Really all we're doing here is breaking out the very HTML intense view rendering portion of that component, right? But it's still part of that component algorithm. Now, all we're doing, again, rendering some HTML, linking to some photos. Obviously, the sources here are sources relative to the expanded zip file once it's on the the user's computer. We're embedding that config object as a JSON payload, so we're serializing it, encoding it, and then we're attaching it to the window config object. I'm not actually using it in any way in this demo, but again, this is something you typically would need to do in a rich interactive report. So let's take a look at what these inline styles and inline scripts are doing. So let's look at inline styles. So you can see the inline styles is doing a directory list of the assets directory. That's this one right here, right? And we can see we have our styles. So it's listing through the list of styles. It's mapping each file path there. And you can see that for each file path, it's actually rendering a snippet of string code here, which is essentially our HTML tags with the embedded data inside of the style. And the inline script, which is right above it, is doing the exact same thing. It's doing a directory list on the scripts instead of the styles. It's mapping over each file. It's generating a script tag with the embedded content, and it's returning it. And then we're just interpolating it into our CFML file. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, as my friend Gabriel Zek likes to say. Right, so going back to our overall algorithm here, right? So we're working inside of our temp directory. We've created a working directory. Step 1, we've downloaded the photos. Step 2, we've rendered the report. Step 3, at this point, now we have the downloaded photos. We have the CFML file, which we've generated, which we've used to generate an HTML file. Now we got to zip all this stuff together. And Lucee CFML makes that wicked easy. All I have to do is use the compress method, point it at my working directory, tell it where to save it, and in this case I'm including the base folder, which is just the folder that gets expanded once the archive gets opened up. And I return that. And that's all there is to it. So let's jump back up to the top, right? So that's it. That's all it took to generate this report with some pretty interesting functionality, in my opinion. Let me just do a quick scan here to see if there's anything of any particular interest. Inlining, rendering the report. We look at that. Oh, so the with temp directory, right? So if we jump back up to the top, right, the generate report, it calls this with temp directory. It passes in a closure. The closure is then invoked with this temp directory. So let's take a look at how that temp directory is being managed by this with temp directory. Jump it down here. So you can see what it's doing is it's going into a scratch directory. It's creating a uniquely named, create unique ID is unique at the server level. So it's creating a uniquely named directory. It's creating it. It's invoking the callback with the name of that file, that temporary directory. And then at the end here, it's recursively deleting everything in this temp directory that just created, which allows the generate report algorithm to use this temp directory without having to clean up after itself, because the with temp directory will do all of the cleaning up on its own. So just, in my opinion, a very nice separation of concerns, keeping the algorithm only as complex as it needs to be, deferring any unneeded complexity to other parts of the component. So yeah, hopefully there's some interesting stuff in here. I think just from a technique standpoint, like from a Lucee CFML technique standpoint, there's some cool things, right? Using this kind of callback-based workflow, handling the temporary directories, downloading the photos, the parallel iteration was pretty snazzy. I think the compress method, inlining the reporting data, rendering the report using this self immediately invoked function expression, using the local mode to make sure that the template execution doesn't accidentally leak variables. Because for example, right, so let's look at this index.cfm file. If we look up here and we look at the loop, this is something that trips people up all the time. This index, this photo variable within this index is unscoped. So even though you are not necessarily imperatively assigning this variable, ColdFusion is doing it for you. So what it's going to do in a normal circumstance is it's going to iterate over this array and then assign each item in turn to this variable, but this variable is unscoped. So normally this would actually leak out into the variable scope of the ColdFusion component. However, because we're executing that ColdFusion template inside of this function with local mode modern, it's going to catch that unscoped variable assignment and treat it as a local variable within this function expression. Come on, man. ColdFusion, Lucee CFML, so hot. It's so hot right now. I can't even get over the fact that I get to program with this all day. Anyway, this is just me thinking about how to generate rich interactive reports, how I'd like to co-locate all of the aspects of that report from the JavaScript and the CSS parts, the CFML templates, and then the actual generation logic. And this is what I've got so far. Hopefully parts of this have been interesting, and anyway, we just keep learning as we go, right? So catch you later.